Hello and welcome to this series. I'm Tyler Coffin, and throughout these videos we'll be seeing everything there is to see within Arturia's expanded recreation of Casio's line of digital synthesizers from the 80s, the CZV. Casio's CZ series of synthesizers, including synths like the CZ1 or CZ1000 among others, was meant to provide low-cost synthesizers built with digital technologies of the 80s, when synth sounds exploded to new heights thanks to other digital synthesizers like Yamaha's DX7 and its successors. However, unlike the digital frequency modulation or FM synthesis of the DX synthesizers, the CZ synths employed Casio's own form of digital synthesis, phase distortion synthesis, which has several similarities technically to FM synthesis and gives sort of similar sounds. Yet it is distinct in how it works, and thus it has its own unique character, which is very versatile in its own way and a lot of fun to deal with, but we will get into that later, so we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves yet. But expanding on what the CZ synths had done in the past, Arturia now also gives us additional possibilities within the playground of phase distortion synthesis, so we can use the systems that defined an era with new possibilities and workflow that is more intuitive to today's standards and can give a fantastic new or classic sound with ease of use and plenty of enjoyment along the way. So a couple of things before we really kick things off. Most everything I'll be doing will be in the standalone mode of the CZV, where you can just deal with everything as its own application, but of course this can be run as a VST, AU, or AAX plugin for whatever DAW you may be using. And we may hop over into a DAW. This is FL Studio, but of course everything will apply wherever else as well. But nothing too out of the ordinary in that sense. And you can also go over to make sure all your audio settings and MIDI settings are what you need them to be. Get your keyboard set up. You'll be able to set the tempo, and that will relate to some of the tempo-based settings that we'll get into as we move forward. For audio settings, you'll need to deal with your drivers however they are in your computer. Or if you're running it through a DAW, all of this stuff will be taken care of in the DAW settings. And I'm also going to scale up the window here so we can see it a little bit better. We'll go to 90. Maybe we'll go to 100. We'll see what works out better. But basically, whatever works for your screen, you can make it as large or as small as you need the window to be. But now that we have a little bit of intro, we're ready to dive into some more info here. And we're going to get our feet wet with this phase distortion synthesis in the next video, so I will see you then. Okay, so before we start getting into the specifics of the CZV itself, we're first going to get a grasp on how the phase distortion synthesis works and sort of a little bit of what's going on under the hood. And this will be a little technical, but not too in-depth, basically just to get an overview and a feel for what's happening so that when we do work in the CZV, we know its place a little better. But starting off with this little bit of background knowledge is going to help us as we step forward along the way. So as I said, digital FM synthesis is sort of related to phase distortion, but not exactly the same. So things like the DX7, which were very difficult to program back in the day, although now with Arturia's DX7V, that's a lot easier, and we've gone through that in another series on Groove 3 if you'd be interested in checking that out. But that frequency modulation synthesis was a little bit more complex than, say, your subtractive synthesis like analog synthesizers would generally be. And with those, you'd take a shape, a more complex shape like a saw, with a lot of harmonics going through, and then work with things like filters to shape a sound from something sharp like a sawtooth into something rounder like a sine wave, which is the simplest one harmonic. And so subtractive is pretty simple in that sense. And so this form of synthesis is where a lot of synthesizers would generally sit, or at least have aspects relating to the subtractive elements. But with digital synthesizers like the DX7 when it came out, or a bunch of other synthesizers that have come out since, this one being Citrus, it takes simpler waveforms like sine waves, and uses one wave to modulate the frequency of another wave, and more accurately it does that through phase modulation, but the effect is roughly the same. So it's basically a really fast vibrato, and you can see it's adding harmonics, so it's a more complex sound. And that's the basic principle of FM. You can see it pretty similarly in the DX7V, when you have your algorithm set up to frequency modulate. And so you get a more complex wave, and you can work it further, make all the different sounds, chaining the modulations together, modulating multiple operators, etc. But doing this is obviously more complicated and you get different sounds because you aren't just working with any shaped wave before. That can obviously be good, but approaching synthesis from a lot of different ways can also be helpful because you see a lot of different things. And the CZV's phase distortion synthesis sort of takes the two of these synthesis types and makes sort of a hybrid of how they are working. It does generate the shapes as opposed to cut them down from more complex shapes, but it does so in a manner that feels more akin to subtractive synthesis in operation. And it also kind of resembles wavetable synthesis in feel once we start getting into working with it, if you're familiar with that kind. But the basic idea is we'll take our wave, and it usually starts as a sine wave, or just that one harmonic. And then from there, we can work that into another shape of wave by basically distorting the shape of the oscillation with a wave shaper, with the DCW or a digitally controlled wave knob. And you can see the effects of that, basically morphing from sine to whatever selected shape here. So it's easy to change that between numerous different shapes here, or even have two separate waves alternate as they generate the sound. So if we have one square and one, whatever we want to select here, a saw, but we'll start with our sine wave with no phase distortion applied. Then you'll have a saw wave and a square wave adjacent to each other, generating a more complex wave than you would really get with other forms of synthesis. So this opens up a lot of possibilities, and you can do great things once you actually start modulating all of the different ways that these interact with each other and stack different DCWs on top of each other and just work with all of the options we have in here together. So long story short, the phase distortion synthesis essentially just takes your waves and uses a digital distortion to shape them into new shapes richer in harmonics, and then changing and morphing between the distortions makes an output sound that can be compared to how a subtractive synthesizer would cut or filter out frequencies when shaping a sound, and you don't have to worry about generating all that through frequency modulation, which can be a bit of a hassle at times. So that's sort of our quick look before we get going. There's a lot of technical information that's not really necessary for the use if you want to get into that. But what we've seen so far should be enough to get us started and see a bit of a preview before getting into a lot of the specifics. But if it does feel a little bit complicated right now, don't worry too much, because once we start actually using it, it really just feels intuitive, and especially the way that Arturia presents it in the CZV, once you get the hang of it, it's not going to be any problem. So with that, we should be ready to dive in a little bit further in the next video, so I will see you then. Alright, so with that little bit of background information, we're now ready to get into the CZV itself. And to begin, we'll just kind of get an overview of everything happening here, get a grasp on the user interface and just kind of the layout of everything here. And then moving forward, we'll get into more details with everything. But just working around the area here, we have all of the different ways we can get into a bunch of different controls on the front panel here. And this shows a number of different things, macros, vibrato, and just kind of a miniature view of a lot of what can be seen in greater detail as you open up the extended panel. And this is just going to have a lot of different things we can do as far as envelopes, pitches, and everything to do with the DCWs of each line in the synthesis tab. Then onto the envelopes tab, you have greater detail and control over those here. Modulations, where we can take those and apply them to a bunch of different places. And also get into an effects chain for each of the sounds, so you can add different things to the sound after it's synthesized. And so all these different tabs just gives you another step of how you're going to shape your sound. And we'll of course dive into each of those individually as we move through everything here, but right now we'll jump back into the front panel so we can just get a feel for a few things. In the lower toolbar in the bottom left, you'll be able to see a readout of whatever parameter you're hovering over. It'll tell you what it is in a greater detail. And also the value of that parameter will have that little box pop up next to your mouse pointer. So you can see both the setting and also in the bottom left, the title of that parameter. So for things where it's not labeled as clearly, like for this parameter here, you can see that that is the amount of phase distortion applied to line 1 in the bottom left corner. To reset controls, you can double click them and then they'll go back to their default value. You can also hold Control or Command on a Mac and click and drag to do fine-tune adjustments of a parameter value. You can also right-click and drag to do that fine-tuning as well, and then double-click to reset. So user interface is pretty easy. You can just make your changes, see exactly the percentage of everything you're doing, move things around, and double click to get them right back where they were before. In the upper toolbar, like we saw, we have things like resizing and getting the audio settings set up, or MIDI. There's also tutorials help. You can get to the user manual if you need to, save your preset, whatever you're working on, import or export presets, and those will then be saved in the browser, which you can open by clicking here, or you can also sort through with this little drop down as well, give you a tree of presets there, or browse through just with arrows to work around that way. In the top right, you have the MIDI assign, and there you can go in and find different settings that you want to be set to parameters on your keyboard if it's enabled for MIDI. And you'll see that purple ones do not have any assigned MIDI control or CC. You can, of course, have that learn, and you'll see the learn ... and then you can turn a knob on your keyboard and then it assigns. And you'll see that it turns red, and my MIDI keyboard can then control that. Assign to that CC, and I can just unassign that if I want. You can do things like change the min and max values of the knob and how it's going to turn. But it's pretty simple to set your MIDI settings however you want them to be and save your configurations, delete, or go back to default, anything like that. And so anything purple can be assigned a MIDI CC control. And then you just turn it off by clicking, and then we're back to where we were. Now that we kind of worked our way through around some of these controls, let's now look at the front panel itself and go through the sections here. And as I said, a lot of these will apply to things later on in the advanced settings, and most of these aren't too terribly complex, but it's a good thing to kind of get a grasp before we move on. So obviously we have the keyboard, we can click around and get the sound out, or we can just play it on the MIDI keyboard, so same deal here. And you can also see the waveforms that are being phase distorted in the screen. You can make changes, everything like that, or go back to the default. You'll see there is the asterisk next to the preset name there, and that meant that I had edited some things in here. Continuing around, we have the pitch bend wheel. Obviously dealing with the pitch bend, and there's a modulation which we'll be able to assign to different things like vibrato, and you can also, of course, use your MIDI keyboard to make those changes. In a similar vein, the macros will be able to assign to different parameters throughout the synth. There are multiple of them, and you can just name them by clicking in here to label the macro so you can keep track of what it is. And we'll do this linking in the modulation tab of the advanced panel later on, and those will vary by preset and save to the preset. So obviously different presets will have different things that those will be linked to. And whether the preset is coming from the factory or yourself, you can assign or use macros on the front panel and adjust and edit the sound without having to dig any further than that. So then moving into the little screen here, we have a few controls that we can change the phase distortion for the different lines, which will essentially be what you would generally call an oscillator, but it's just called a line. It's just how the waveforms are generated. But you'll probably be dealing more so with that in the synthesis tab in the advanced panel. For now, we will move on into the vibrato though, and that is, as you might expect, it's just going to be a movement in whatever shape you choose for the vibrato waveform. In this case, a triangle. If I turn that up, you just hear a varying amount of pitch bending up and down with that shape at whatever rate of oscillation. And that can be pretty pronounced, or you can dial it back. It's just nice to be able to add or take that away very quickly right on the front panel. And you can also sync that to the tempo. So you have a tempo-based movement of the vibrato, or you can also just do it by a low to high 0 to 99 scale, which gets an interesting nearly audio range of oscillation. And then there's also a delay, so that just takes a little bit of time before the vibrato starts to show itself. So it's a nice and pretty straightforward way to just add some vibrato in. Nothing that's going to be too complex, and it's all right there for you. And I'll double click to reset to 0, and we can move into the arpeggiator, which does as you expect an arpeggiator to do. You can just turn it on, and you get an arpeggio of the played notes. You can change that rate according to tempo or a subdivision of it, or you can turn that off and just do it by a hertz value or a cycle per second. And you can also turn on hold, where you don't have to hold down the key and it'll just continue doing the arpeggiation until you turn the hold off. Gate is going to be the amount of time that the note is actually held as it does the pattern. So you can have very short or relatively long holds on the notes of the arpeggiation. And speaking of which, you can of course change the pattern. So you have as played, up, down, 1 and 2, and just random. And you can kind of see how they would be related to each other by their little graphics here. As played would just be as you play the notes, it will continue and loop in that pattern. Up will do it ascending from lower notes to high notes, down the opposite. Up, down 1 just goes up and down, ascending and descending up the pitch values. And 2 will just hit and repeat the top and bottom notes as it repeats. Random, of course, just is random. And you also have the octaves that you can do. So if you hit just one note, you can introduce different octaves of the arpeggiation that is playing. So it repeats over multiple octaves. So that can be a fun way to add some rhythmic-based triggering of the notes just by playing a chord or whatever you want to have going there. And it's nice and simple to get it set whatever way you may want it. Over in the modulation section here, we have a few controls, and they're going to be related again to things we'll see in greater detail in the extended panel, but you can kind of see how they're working. You can have different lines available. So 1 is obviously going to be related to line 1, the top one here. Line 2 would be down there, and it's like having either of those oscillators, as they may be called elsewhere, playing. You can also have both, or you can have a duplicate of 1 playing, so you can detune or modulate with 2 lines. And you can turn on ring modulation when there are both of them, or noise. And all of this stuff is going to have greater control in the advanced panel, where you can see all the same stuff in different manners. You can turn on and off, and you'll see how they relate to the line select in the front panel. Next to the keyboard, we have portamento, polyphony. So with polyphony, you can have multiple notes. We'll turn off the arpeggiator. And with it off, it's monophonic, so only one note can play at a time. So it's just a matter of being able to set that. If you're in monophonic, you can also have the portamento for the amount of time it takes to slide to a note. Polyphonic, you won't hear it unless you overlap notes or if the length or envelopes happen to overlap. And on the left side of the keyboard, you just have a volume slider, which is a master volume. And on top, there's also a master tune, as we kind of saw when we were playing around. It's just by a matter of sense. Again, you can right-click or control-click to fine-tune if you want something to be slightly off in any way or anything like that, and double-click to reset. You have an octave. And a unison detune, and that's going to have to do with the unison down below. With just one unison voice, as we have right now, there's not going to be any difference. But if we go down into the lower toolbar and add more unison, we'll just add 4 for now. We can now create unison voices and detune them amongst each other to thicken out the sound. Or just have the one and deal with it in that way. Also in the lower toolbar, there is the amount of polyphony voices, and this will be affected by the amount of unison voices too. And basically, as you have more or less unison voices, it will allow more or less polyphony. So at the extreme, 8 voices of unison only allows 4 polyphony, but you'll be able to adjust that and balance and allocate the voices you need to play with. Generally, you'll probably keep your polyphony higher so you can just play as many notes as you need to and not worry about it, but for CPU purposes, that might be something you might want to limit. And speaking of which, you do have the CPU monitor on the bottom, which can tell you if you're going to be peeking out anything or pushing your computer too far, which is possible, but if you keep an eye, you'll generally be able to keep it in check pretty well. There's also a panic button to basically kill your sound if anything is hanging over too long or if something got stuck on, anything like that. And you can change your MIDI channel. So pretty simple there. There's also the bend range, and that's going to relate to your pitch bend. So say you want a full octave of pitch bend, or whatever amount of semitones or half steps for that pitch bend to relate to. It's just set by this drop down here. And then there's also the CZ DAC, which refers to the digital to analog converter of the original CZ synthesizers, which essentially is just a way to add some digital grit, since past technology obviously was not as strong as computers are today. And if you want the really true to the original synth sound, you can add some of those noises and digital imperfections that were present in synthesizers of the past. It's a subtle difference, but you can kind of hear a bit more noise when the DAC is turned on. It just runs a different output of the sounds being generated that can be simulated to be more true to what the original synthesizers would sound like when actually outputting sound. So just a matter of fidelity and whatever you're looking for in the generation of the sound. Well, that should cover our overview of everything in here, and also the front panel, plus everything else we see in the user interface of the CZV. And next up, we'll be ready to jump into some of the more complex things in the synthesis section of the advanced panel in the next video, so I will see you then. Okay, so now we're ready to get into the synthesis tab, so we'll open up the extended panel here, and we'll start with the synthesis. I have a default preset here. I just set it up to be as basic as we can be. Oh, and I did click here again to close that, so you can click anywhere up top or those arrows in the corner. And that'll open the extended panel where we can get into all this sort of stuff. But the synthesis tab is going to be where we really make the main generation of the sound that we're going to be editing. And really, most of the heavy lifting of the synthesizer will be done in here, although there are obviously more things we can add on to that. But the main business of the CZV is going to take place here. And although they're called lines, we can kind of think of these like they would be oscillators elsewhere in other synthesizers. It's basically the same idea, but there are obviously a few different things happening because this is the phase distortion synthesis with its own sort of terminology. But thinking of it as an oscillator section is not really wrong, just kind of a different term for it. But anyway, we have the two lines here, which we can turn on and off with their power buttons here, and you'll see that that does obviously change the line select that we had on the front panel. But we'll just deal with one line for now. Next to that, you can click the duplicate, and that turns it into two of the same line ones, just duplicated, and we can detune them and stuff like that in here. But for now, again, we'll just keep it on the one. And then we have a knob for the DCW, or digitally controlled wave, and that's basically going to be what turns on our phase distortion synthesis. Then there's a level and a pan, which is just simply volume and stereo placement. And you can double click to reset those, but pretty straightforward. As for that phase distortion synthesis, as we saw before, we have two selections here, and those are going to be what we can shape the wave, and we'll see the waveform generated here right now with it turned down and the saw wave selected. We can just go between a sine wave when it's at 0 and a saw wave when it's at 100%, because we are distorting each of those two cycles of the wave into that other shape of a saw wave. And right now, those are both set to be the same destination, and we can keep it that way if we click this link button, so they'll always be together in whatever waveform we're selecting. Or if we turn off that link, we can select different waves, and you'll notice that since we have those two cycles here, displayed in the screen here, when we now turn up the DCW knob, we get two unique shapes for each of the different cycles, and this is then what we call a compound wave. So it's two different waveforms alternating as it generates a sound wave, and that can cause some very cool things to happen. And so we have all these different ones we can choose from: saw, square, pulse. So pretty recognizable sounds there. There's also a double sine, and in that case we start with actually an octave up essentially, or two cycles per cycle. And so linking that with something that's another cycle, like a regular saw, we can get some interesting combinations of how those waves work together. And on top of that, there's also resonant ones, so it acts like we have a filter on it. And more or less that sounds like a subtractive synthesizer where we have a filter with resonance on the cutoff, and we're sweeping the DCW to get that effect. And that can obviously be played with a compound wave to get a cool combination there, and that's a lot of fun to work those combinations together to make compound waves that complement each other in interesting ways. And on top of just using the waves that are provided there, we can also do things like draw in our own phase distortion function, and that's where it gets really fun. And how this works is essentially like a wave shaper or a distortion. That's why it's called phase distortion synthesis. We have the input phase on this axis and the output phase here. So with nothing happening, obviously we aren't distorting anything at all. But if we do some sort of curve or shape to the distortion function, we see that the basic output would be this diagonal line here from bottom left to top right. And when that line turns into some other shape, we get distortion of our wave. And you'll see that as we turn it up here. The blue baseline becomes the yellow target distortion function. And you can also see the effect on the wave itself. And we don't have to do things as simple as just adding a curve. We can also add points in here just by clicking and change their own individual curves, add more points, anything like that. And you'll see how you can distort that wave into all kinds of different shapes that might be more or less jagged, more or less simple, anything like that. And your distortion function changes shape from the base to the target, and then you could do things like have different types of waves for different cycles of the compound wave, so it doesn't have to be the custom. You could have half of the wave be resonant and half be your custom wave. Or you can even draw in a separate custom wave for each of the waveform boxes, so the first and second oscillation of the line. And that gives you plenty of flexibility to draw in and also use another wave for your compound waves in a line. So it's very easy to do that, and when you're done, you can just right-click to delete those. Or if you want to try another shape or draw in anything else, you can double-click to reset any of the tensions, anything like that. And you'll also note that we can see these points in here. So you can select between different points at the bottom of the screen too, and change the positions that way with the X and Y coordinates, and also the slope for those points. So if you want to be more precise in those movements, you can do it that way. And so with that chain parameter off, each of the waveforms can have a completely different distortion function if it's something that's pre-made or one that you make in your custom base and target like we've done. Plus you can also save your presets. If you make something you like, you can save it as a shape and then recall it or delete it with this X. And that way, if you like something that you made, you can quickly recall it. But you'll also notice down at the bottom there is this target. You can change where it starts. Instead of just a sine wave, you can start at some sort of complex wave when it's at 0. You can have it be something already distorted at its base level of 0 instead of the sine wave, and then you're changing from your distorted wave to a differently distorted wave. So you can get kind of the possibilities of different ways you can make those waves morph into each other through the phase distortion between the base and target distortion functions. So having those two waves opens up all kinds of different ways we can work our DCWs into really cool compound shapes that can morph and do a lot of different things. And then when we start doing things with two lines together, we can do things like ring modulation and some other stuff too that will open some doors for us. But all of this really shows the strengths and applications of phase distortion synthesis, which really does a great job at making cool sounds. And it does so as simply as it is laid out in the CZV. So again, like we saw, it's sort of a combination of FM synthesis and kind of more of a subtractive synthesis workflow. So a lot simpler than FM, having to deal with frequency modulating and everything like that. It's really just one knob and you create the destinations that you're going to be making. So you're working from a simple wave into something more complex instead of the subtractive wave, but it's just a bit more of a direct process than FM can be considered to be. But of course, everything has its uses, and phase distortion is one that we can use and generate some really great sounds. But for now, we're going to take a minute and let this set in, and then we'll come back to continue down the rest of the synthesis tab, so I'll see you in the next video. Alright, so now we're ready to look through the rest of the synthesis tab, and continuing through the line sections, we also have pitch, DCW, and amp tabs down here. And those are just basically as simple as they can be, or as you'd expect from an oscillator in any other synth. The pitch is just an envelope for your pitch. You can drag points. And you see the little dot for the travel of what's happening. You can just basically change the envelope of the pitch. And I have the CZ DAC. I'm going to turn that off. Make things a little bit less noisy, not that it's a big deal. But simple there. You have these 4 points. You can select at the bottom, same way we did with the distortion. Set their time and level values to map out their position. And later in the envelopes tab, we'll be able to deal with other types, but basically we can just click around and move points, change their levels, change the slope, or you can also add points. If you want to change the sustain, you can double click, and it will sustain at that point instead of another. You can right click to remove, and you can also change the amount of time that you're looking at, clicking and dragging at the timeline up here, and double click to reset. So a pretty simple envelope there, and you'll be able to see these envelopes also in the envelope tab when we get to that, but having them conveniently in the synthesis tab as well is nice. DCW is just basically going to be the same idea, except instead of for pitch, you're working on the DCW, so you can see that when we hit a note, it triggers this envelope of the DCW knob. And similarly, we can draw in points, do anything that we would want to do in that way to get the shape of movement of that knob, similar to how you would have an envelope on a filter in a subtractive synthesizer. And in the same sort of vein, the amp envelope is just the same, except for it just works on the amplitude or volume. So you can make a very percussive sort of sound there. Have the release of the sound, do anything there. It's pretty simple as far as drawing in envelopes goes. Nothing too complicated, nothing too out of the ordinary. But they are nice to have around. And when we do have 2 lines, we can copy envelopes between each of the lines just by clicking the arrow. You just copy that one over to the other. And you'll note that it doesn't have to be to the same envelope. You can copy DCW to DCW or amp to DCW. It doesn't have to be to the same type. So whatever shape you want to move over, you can copy that to the other line. Now I'm going to go back to the default so we just have a simple sine wave again, and we can work with that. And I will enable line 2 here, which is the same as line 1. It just is like the secondary version of it. So when you're detuning, you're going to be detuning the line 2 because it has that little apostrophe there. That's like the follower wave. So you can offset it by an octave or a semitone note, or just a fine-tune amount. And again, for any of these, look at the bottom left corner and you'll be able to see a readout of what we're looking for. And it'll say relative to line 1, everything like that. And we can get a closer look to exactly what's happening. And again, if you wanted this to be a duplicate of line 1, you can just turn that into line 1 prime, or that little apostrophe there. And then you're detuning a copy of line 1 instead of a separate waveform. But it's a similar situation. Next, we have this modulation row. So we can turn on things like ring modulation, which is a form of amplitude modulation. And you'll note that with the amount at 0, it's as if line 2 is not even on. But the ring modulation adds overtones to the sound in the form of the sum and difference frequencies of the generators. So if you have different notes, you can get interesting combinations there, especially when you do things like ring modulate by different shapes and pitches in different ways. It can get into an interesting sound, but it's very simple to add those sorts of things on there. You also have noise. And this is separate from the noise source below, but it is essentially just modulating the right line, so 2 or the duplicate of 1 by a noise value, so a random rapid movement. So you can hear just that randomness added on to that line there. So between the two, we have all sorts of different ways we can modulate and manipulate the second line from the first. Either 2-on-1 with the ring modulation or noise, and whatever detuning from each other. So with that off, we'll look at the noise source, and that's simply just a noise generator. You can hear, you can just turn on a bit of noise, change the color from darker, lower frequencies or higher frequencies for higher color values. So you can just generate an amount of noise to add into the sound. And that again is separate from the noise generator here. So that doesn't make any difference there. So that covers all the controls in the synthesis tab. And really it's enough to get a lot done in itself, and you can really take care of most of what you need to do in sound generation here. But obviously there's plenty of other things we can get to and work on our sound in other places. And you could do things like add unison, change that unison detuning to make copies of the sound and just detune them to get a thicker sound there. But this should be good here, and we're ready to get into the envelopes tab in the next video, so I will see you then. Alright, so now we are ready to get into the envelopes tab of the CZV. And in the synthesis tab, we have seen a number of envelopes already for each of the lines 1 and 2. We have the pitch, DCW, and amp envelopes, but they don't have as many options available as there are in the envelopes tab itself. So in here, we do have the same parameters available for lines 1 and 2, the amp, DCW, and pitch. But we also have mod envelopes that we can then link to different parameters in the modulations tab later. But the idea here is basically we have all of the different envelopes, and we'll be able to edit them quickly and with each other and do things like add something in there. You have both of them available. You can see the changes in them when you play. And you can also do things like copy and paste by just clicking on the copy button for the envelope and then clicking on it for the one you want to copy onto. And you can cancel just by clicking it again on the one you have selected. And you can also copy to multiple places if you hold Control or Command on a Mac to select multiple destinations for a copied envelope. But copying around different things is pretty simple like that. And as far as actually making the envelopes themselves, it's also not too hard. We kind of saw a little bit of that earlier. I'm going to reset this patch so everything is in its default sort of setting. And all of the different envelopes work essentially the same for programming. There are a few differences though. Mods can go bipolar, so the movement of the mod envelope could go over and under the setting that it is modulating. And the same with the pitch. You could do the bipolar and go over and under the played note frequency. There's also velocity settings for a number of these where you can have velocity affect the envelope. So when it's turned up to an amount of 15, the velocity is linked and has an effect on whatever parameter the envelope is associated with. So with the velocity linked, you can hear with lower velocities, the output's quieter. And keyboard follow the same idea. You just have that for up to 9, where when it's turned up like that, lower keys will have a slower rate than higher keys, as you can see by the dot moving. But the default value for those are 0, where there's no linking of either of those effects. And you'll also notice this other drop down over here. This is the envelope generation mode. We have the CZ, the DA/DSR, and MSEG. CZ is up to 8 different points. We just click to add points, so we can have up to 8 of them. Just left click to add and right click to delete them. And you need to have a minimum of 2 points to make this work. And you'll see that this one has a sustain at the beginning right now with this S. And you'll notice that we can just click and drag these around to move them. And if we slow it down enough, we can actually see the movement of the dot showing the position of the envelope. So the sustain just means that when holding a note, it will sit at this value. And we can click up here to scroll around on the timeline bar. And when we have a point selected, we have the controls like we saw on the synthesis tab down here, but these ones are a little different since we're in the CZ type envelope, but not too much different. It's just a level like before. The rate is going to be the amount of time it takes. The lower the rate, the slower the travel there, but a faster rate, it gets to it quickly and gets to that sustain since it's set to that. But if we add another one, double click there, we moved our sustain point to this one instead. And so it'll make whatever travel with whatever points are happening before the sustain, and then as long as we hold a note, it holds there. And when the envelope is long enough, we can actually see the dot travel and hold on the sustain. But when editing, another thing we can note is if we hold shift, you move all of the different points after whatever one you're moving. So if we add a couple here and hold shift, everything moves, whereas if we don't hold shift, it's just moving one point. But we'll make this a little bit longer so we can see what's happening. And then when I let go after sustain, it continues through the rest of this movement. But nothing too crazy here. It's just drawing in the points and putting things where they need to be. Choosing your sustain, or you can also have no sustain. So we just turn that off, and then it just plays through the entire envelope and stops once it gets to the end as a little one-shot sort of deal. And then there's also an endpoint selector, so you can cut down to whatever your last one is, and that'll be the end of your envelope. And again, for the CZ envelopes, you need to have at least 2 points for a start and end, and you can add more points as you need them. Finally, in the bottom right, for some of these envelopes, we'll have a level or a depth for other ones. For amp, it's going to be a level, since it's just basically the level that the amp is traveling. Obviously, lower going to be quieter. And rate multiplier is just what it says. You can make it slower or faster, depending on the speed you want the envelope to be in this shape. It's just a multiplier to adjust that, which is certainly helpful for little tweaks. For DCW, if we change that to a CZ type envelope, that same thing is called depth instead. So if we had a point there, since it's DCW, that's going to be changing the shape of our line. And you can see it moving like that, just like we saw in the synthesis tab. It's doing the same thing, but we're working with a CZ envelope because we set it here. And this depth instead of the level is just going to be how far up that travel is going to be for the wave. Again, basically just a multiplier, and then we do have the multiplier for the rate as well. But the CZ envelope is nice and simple, and it does replicate the Casio CZ envelopes of the actual hardware synthesizer. So if you want to be as original as possible, you can do this with the up to 8 points. And it's a plenty capable envelope, and especially good for its time. But we also have a few options we can choose from for different envelope types. The DADSR is just going to be pretty simple. We'll do it for the amp. It's just a delay, attack, decay, sustain, and release. So you just have those parameters laid out on the bottom. Delay, attack. Peak is going to be the percentage at which the attack is going to hit. Decay is going to be how long it takes to get to the sustain percentage of the travel. And then release is just how long it takes for it to reach 0 after that. And then again, you have the same controls in the bottom right, like the multipliers for level and rate. So just the same, it's just a matter of moving these points around. However, you can't add new ones into this one. So you just have to deal with the shape that's given to you here. And it's just a basic shape, and especially for the amp, it's not really going to need anything more than this usually. And again, you can click and drag on top to see larger areas. And you have that dot to show you where you're hitting. And you can just click around to get a simple envelope like this. And a lot of synthesizers end up using this sort of thing. It's pretty common, especially for ones that don't have a graphical interface like this. But it's simple to use and covers a lot of uses, so it can suffice just fine as long as you're not doing anything too complex with what parameter is using the envelope. But we do have the option to go a step further into the MSeg, and this is quite a bit further down the line. We have all kinds of points. We're not limited to 8. We can have 16, so we can really load up with some sort of crazy travel that we want their envelope to evolve with. And then each point also has tensions that we can edit, or slopes of the lines point to point, to add different travel, different roundness to the points of an MSeg. And other than that, it really works pretty similarly to the CZ envelope. We can also hold shift to move everything afterwards, or just move a single point without holding shift. Right click to remove points. left click to add them, and then just click on these lines to change tensions, double click to reset to linear. And for that sort of thing, it's not too hard. You can change your view by clicking and dragging on the timeline up here. We have level and rate multipliers, and also a sync button, but we'll get to that in just a moment. That'll be involving tempo. But before we do, we also can see that everything has to be in the same type of generation mode to be able to see the gray line of it moving in the background. So if we want to see all the active envelopes, they all have to be the same type, so we can go in and change that. So if it's CZ, you can't see the MSEG envelopes behind it. They'll have to be shared in that type. But you'll be able to see whatever other envelope is set to that same kind of envelope in gray behind the envelope shown. And they'll also have little dots showing movement, so you can see sort of everything moving in the way that it will be when playing. Now, like the other ones, we can select different points down here. Instead of clicking and dragging graphically, you can change the time of them, the level, everything like that, slope. So all of that is nice and simple to deal with and set that movement. Additionally, with MSEG, we can have loops happen. So we change the point that we want the loop to start. Say we want it to be 0.3, and we want it to end on 0.8, whatever that is. If we hold a note, we just travel and continue through that loop section until we let go of the note, and then it continues along until its ending point. This can also be helpful if we sync, and that will sync to tempo. So you can draw in things here. The timeline has a grid based on the tempo and whatever subdivision you set in the rate multiplier. And you just set those times, and remember, we can also do things like right-click to fine-tune times, and you can snap to important grid lines. And since they're snapping, you're to the tempo, and you can change the rate multiplier, and you'll be to the tempo set in the settings here or in your DAW. For looping on tempo, you got to make sure it does end on a snapped point, though. So to be sure of that, just keep an eye on your ending point of the loop. So if you're in a DAW, this sort of thing will sync it to your DAW's tempo, and that can be helpful if you're going to program in some sort of a pattern that you want to loop around and be linked to the tempo for that section. You can set it to be some sort of a rhythmic pattern of the parameter in the envelope. And then on top of that, you also have things like presets, so you can click on those in the top. Maybe you want to change your rate or unsync it even. But you will note that synced and unsynced MSEG envelopes have separate presets available for you to choose from, or templates if you want to call them that. It's basically that idea. And the synced ones have different ways you can set them up and play around with. So just plenty of ways you can draw different envelopes and just make a sound or a travel that you want one of these parameters to follow when making a sound. And when we get to mods, we can also do things that employ these different movements to all kinds of different things. And quickly to mention also, there is this poly or mono selection for just the mod envelope, actually. And the mod envelope only triggers if it's linked to something in the modulations tab, which it's not right now. But the poly button just makes it so that it triggers a new instance of the envelope for every note played, or with it off, it just continues with one. And again, for the mod envelope to be active, we'd have to link it to a parameter in the modulations tab, which we will shortly. But you can see all of the other envelopes working in the background of this envelope since they're all MSEG. But really nothing too unexpected here. A number of things that we can just do to draw in different points for different parameters to define their travel, and do so in a variety of different ways with different generation modes. But with that, we're all set to move on into modulations in the next video, so I will see you then. Okay, so now we are ready to look at the modulations tab of the CZV. And this is going to be where we can link various sources to various destinations, multiple at a time, or a lot of different things, just to make control of various parameters be simple and all just in one place. And it does a great job of showing you all of the information and all the things that you need to work with right here. So the main area here is going to be the modulation matrix, and that is where you'll be doing the linking of different parameters. So on the left side here, you have various sources that you can scroll through and pick different ones from the list here. Right now we have mod wheel just by default onto this particular row here, and that is linked to a destination. In this case, it's a global value you pick from these different categories. This one is the vibrato depth, as you would see on the front panel, and it's set to an amount. And now when you turn up the modulation wheel, it basically offsets the vibrato depth by whatever amount you have set here. And really the concept of all the modulation is that simple. It's just a matter of linking these various sources to different destinations. And obviously we have plenty of different things that we can use for that, from different pitch envelopes, DCW envelopes, any of those different things that we programmed in the other areas of the synthesizer. And then we also have a few other ones down here that you can pick from, combinates, and that will be in the section here for LFOs and things like that, sample and hold, all that business. But doing things like mod wheel or pitch bend wheel, you can set that aftertouch or expression pedal, so MIDI signals, or the macros, for instance. So if you want macro 1 to have an effect on the vibrato depth by a larger amount, you can also do that. And now you have two sources linked to that one destination, so both of them offset by that amount. You can just double click to reset or double click to unlink. So let's say we want macro 1 to, we'll just do something here. We'll do the master tuning so it's easy to hear. We can go up by an amount. And so the source is offsetting whatever the destination is set to in that column and row intersection to that point. And for macros, you can also go downward. So it's a bipolar situation. But you can also do things like invert. So if you want to go to negative, then up is going to turn down. And you can do that with any sort of parameter that would go up or down. And remember that you can link multiple things there. You can have the mod wheel also linked to the tuning, or have all sorts of different combinations of sources linked to multiple destinations. And if you want to change those, it's quick to do that. You can change to the mod envelopes. And mod envelopes, obviously we saw those before in the envelopes tab, but we also have those same ones easily accessible here in the envelopes tab on the right side here. So you can click and change those just the same way we did before. They have all the same settings and they are directly related to each other, so any changes are the same. So whatever programming you end up doing for the envelopes will just carry over between any of the places you'll see them in the tabs. But basically, now that we do have the mod envelope linked to something, you can see a dot for that too. And you can see what it is dealing with. So maybe we want line 2, that to be the DCW. And obviously we also have the DCW envelope that we could do that same thing. But in this manner, you could have however many sources working on it, or we can go the opposite direction, in which case we would have to have that DCW turned up and then it would go downward, the inverted direction of the mod envelope. So nothing too terribly complex here, but you can take and program anything in there, and then you also have a second 8x8 section here that you can program completely different ones, and they'll all be linked to the different places you put them. So it gives you a lot of power to set controls and linkages in all kinds of different places. And so you can put everything together and make it a really interwoven control of the sound from all the different sources. And speaking of which, there's a few other sources that we have that we can play with here, and those are the LFOs, sample and hold, and combinates. And what we'll do for those is we go over to this other tab here, and we'll see we have LFOs 1, 2, and the sample and hold. And there's nothing too terribly out of the ordinary for these. We have different shapes for the waveforms, pretty standard shapes, and there's also a sample and hold for each LFO, but this is unrelated to the independent one on the right. But this one just samples a random noise generator at the defined times. And you can set the rate at which it's going to be taking those samples by the rate setting here. And then you can go into this LFO rate type dropdown and change the way you have it synced. It could be by tempo with binary, triplets, or dotted. So just different subdivisions of where it's doing this. And the rate setting is a fraction of the tempo, or just the hertz value or a cycle per second. So you have those options. And instead of doing that, you could also do key trigger. And at that point, it resets every time you play a key. So especially for LFOs, you can see that more evidently there. Also, we can turn on an amount of cycles we want it to go for. So when you key trigger, it just performs however many cycles you have there and then stop. So it's almost more of an envelope at that point. You can also make it delay when you do that. So when you play the note, it then delays however many seconds you have there and then begins the amount of cycles you will have for the LFO. And with key trigger off, obviously it just works as a regular LFO, continually performing its cycles. At the top of each LFO also we have the monophonic and polyphonic. Monophonic just means that when the LFO is triggered, it is applied to every voice the same, whereas with polyphonic, it re-triggers a new LFO for every voice played. So each voice triggers its LFO, and that sort of resembles the key trigger down here. So just a few different ways that the LFO can be applied. LFO 2 works the same way, all the same controls. It's just a separate one that you can use to have a different one on your sources. The sample and hold is similar to the sample and hold here, but instead of taking its samples from just a noise generator, it's going to be able to take it from multiple places. And then it just picks a spot at a defined time to hold at that point. Say you want LFO 1 to be your source, it will pick a new place to sample and hold, and we'll have to turn the key trigger on for that to work with the LFO. You can kind of make out the same sine LFO through the sample and holds that we did every time we hit a note. And all that's basically doing is taking a spot wherever it is when you make that trigger to sample and hold. It holds that spot. And obviously we can go from the noise generator. That's just a random sound. So it could be anywhere at any time, but it's a relatively simple idea. You can also smooth. And that just gives it an amount of time before it reaches the place that it wants to be for its time that it takes the sample, as opposed to just an abrupt jump to wherever it is. And yes, it does say smoot, but you can look in the bottom left and it will say smooth. And smooth doesn't have to be on with the key trigger. You can also smooth any of these times. You can have them linked to the same subdivisions of tempo if you want to do it that way. For binary, triplets, or dotted notes. And like the LFOs, it's just another one of the sources that you can select from in the mod matrix. Finally, here we have the combinate section, and that gives us a way to combine any of these different sources together in different ways, and basically it's just going to give us some arithmetic that we can handle here. So let's say we want to take the mod wheel value, since that's going to be an easy one we can see. We can just turn up and down, and you'll see in the results section here what it is doing. And I'll use my keyboard too, so I don't have to move the mouse over there. But basically you can just add that to another type of mod source from the list here. So let's say we did LFO 1. And since we have the add type selected, we can add those two together by the amount. So if we turn up all the way our mod wheel, we can then add in up to the full value of our LFO 1. So now we're moving by whatever the combination of those two are, and the amount is basically just the amount of the mod applied to the source. So at 0.5, you're pretty much applying half of the full value for LFO 1 onto the value of the mod wheel. So let's say we instead do one of our mod envelopes. Let's just make a quick one here. We'll delete this so we have just basically a simple decay down to a sustain. We'll double click to get that there. And back on this page, we have those two together, but if we wanted to subtract the mod envelope amount, we could just change that to a minus, and now it goes the opposite direction. And we can also do that by a multiplied amount. Or we could have it combinate with any of these other arithmetic functions that we have in the drop-down. So if the mod wheel is at 0 and you're multiplying by anything, it's going to be 0. But if you turn that up, you get the product of mod wheel times mod envelope. Plus, we're hearing some of the vibrato because the mod wheel is also linked to that over in the matrix. Or you could do division, or there's also crossfading, where essentially instead of combining them by a sum or a product or any of those functions like that, it instead just travels by either one or the other and crossfades between them. So at 0, you're just showing the source result, which is the mod wheel, and then if we turn it to 1, you're just showing the mod amount, so you're just fading between the effects of the combinate source and mod, so it's just giving you a crossfade between the two of them. And then you can even go as far as to combinate your combinations. So you can really make this quite in-depth if you want it to be. But the overall idea you can take from it is that you can really make any sort of movement from the sources and then make those sources even more complex or combined in a way to give really specific or fine-tuned movement to destination parameters. And that opportunity really adds a lot to be able to do things in all of the different places, whether it's effects or any of the different parameters throughout all these destinations, even if those destinations happen to be related to other sources. So really, the way you can combine all of these different aspects, whether it's something just to make control easier on the front panel or add vibrato so you can do certain effects with your MIDI keyboard or anything like that, the Modulations tab gives you a lot of options to work with that sort of stuff. So with that, we have seen everything in here, and we're ready to move on to the effects section in the next video, so I will see you then. Alright, so now we are in the Effects tab, which is the one on the far right here, and it's the last tab here in the CZV. And for the most part, it is pretty straightforward, so that is nice. But it gives us the ability to add a number of different effects onto our outputs, and then also have them routed in different ways, so that we can put together a final little polish on the output sound you're making. So first we'll go through the routing, and it's pretty simple here. When you have it set to the series mode here with the two arrows into each other, it's just basically a straight chain of effects. So effects slot 1 will go into 2, into 3, and into 4. Then the output after that. So your effects are going to be stacked on top of each other at that point and fed into each other so they build as you go down the chain. But you can also turn it on parallel, and in that case you have it separated into different lines going through different paths of effects. So line 1 has effect slot 1 and 4. And you'll see the little arrow pointing. This is the path of line 1, and then you have a gain. Then line 2 has these two effect slots, and its gain after that. So you have two parallel paths for effects on the different lines that you'll be able to mix together in the output. And having those options, you can piece together a kind of sound that fits whatever you're going for, and make the sort of effects chain that fits your sound. So now getting into the effects that are really available, we have a number of different ones here. A lot of them are pretty familiar to just a basic effects set here. You can select a reverb, you just pick them from the drop down, and then the slot is filled up with the associated parameters. And each one of them has a bypass or turn on button here. You can turn on the effect or bypass it, and then you can turn up the dry wet mix. Default is at 50% if you double click. Well, you just determine how much of the mix you want to be the effect output or the unaffected signal. But to look through these effects specifically, we won't go too in depth, but we'll just kind of get an overview of everything here. The reverb has high pass frequency, low pass frequency to just filter the reverb sound. You can just kind of tune it together to make sense, the size. Changing it just changes the pitch because it's going to be a dynamic change there. Damping just controls the rate of the high frequency decay. Width is stereo width. And the pre-delay just sets how long it is before the reverb kicks in. Decay, you'll notice, is a different color. And that's not because it does anything different than you expect, but actually because each of the effects have a parameter that you can link to a modulation destination. So you'll notice that we have effects, and then you'll see effects 1, reverb, dry wet. That's just the dry wet that you can select on the side here, so you can modulate that in the mod matrix, but you can also do the reverb decay, and that is the parameter that is this green color. So you can link that to whatever you want to link to a source on the side there, if you want to do it that way. And you'll see that each of the effect slots have a parameter that is able to be linked as a mod, and that is different for each of the different effects available. So it's just the parameter that makes the most sense to be able to modulate by a source, and for the reverb, it happens to be the decay. Continuing down here, we have a delay. Again, a pretty straightforward delay. You can change the time. You can do it by synced subdivisions or just a millisecond value that you can set here. And time is, of course, the mod parameter. There's also feedback to see how much you feed into the delay. There's a high-pass filter you can turn up. You can also do some spread to give it stereo width. You can also do ping pong in that case, so that it goes back and forth between the ears, and also a low-pass frequency to go with the dry wet to see how much you actually want to hear. And that's really all there is for the delay. Continuing, there's the chorus. You can select how many voices, whether it's going to be stereo or mono, the shape of the modulating of the voices. So depending on the speed or frequency, that can be more or less noticeable. And so you're dealing with that detuning effect of however many voices moving in the shape of a sine or a square wave. So there's some mildly different flavors to play with. The delay is the amount of time delay applied to the input signal. Depth is how far above or below the pitch will be traveling. Frequency, like we saw, is the speed. And feedback is just how much of the output is fed back into the sound. So you can get to a really deep chorus, almost a flanger sort of effect, or just really push it. So that can be an interesting spaced out sort of effect, and maybe we'll be able to hear it a little better if we give our wave a little bit more higher harmonics. But overall, it's pretty interesting, and feedback is the mod destination for this effect. We'll continue on to a phaser, and phasers can be used for a whooshing, sweeping sort of sound. And for this one, the LFO rate is the mod parameter. Again, you can sync it or have it in hertz. Have the shape be any of these in the drop down. More shapes available than in the chorus. LFO amount. It's how large the sweep is of the phaser. Pulls will be the steepness of the filter. Frequency is the harmonic center. Feedback, again, is how much of the output is fed back in. So you can get very pronounced phaser effects. You can make it very stereo. Put together some interesting things there to get either a subtle phaser or something very much integral to the sound. Flangers also are fairly similar. You can have it be a stereo. Change the shape, triangle or sine. Change the polarity of how it's working, feedback. High pass, low pass frequencies. Add delay to it. And depth. And for the frequency, again, you can do that synced or hertz rate. And get some very pronounced ones there, or you could tone it down to be a subtle flanger and work together some of the dry wet. So depending what you're going for, the option is there. And if you want to do some modulation onto that frequency, it is that sort of parameter that can be linked to modulations in the mod matrix. Filters is probably where you would most likely want to do some linking to the mod matrix, because in this case, it's essentially making it into a subtractive synthesizer like some people may be used to using. So like, for instance, if you just want a low-pass filter here, this is a multi-mode filter, and you can select between low-pass, high-pass, band-pass. and comb feedback or feed forward. But using this filter, you can add resonance. And this is one where you probably would want to have fully wet. So you're only hearing the filter output, and that's what's sending through the rest of the chain here. So in doing so, if you wanted to just get yourself a saw wave, it is as if you're just doing a subtractive synthesizer like you would be any other time. You could just go in and use that filter cutoff, link that to one of your mod envelopes, and now your sound is just going through a filter like it would be on any synthesizer that would do that, which is pretty common. So you can use those subtractive synthesis elements in this phase distortion synthesizer pretty easily using the effects. And having that filter can give you a number of ways to play around and put together a potentially interesting sound. We'll reset the dry wet to 50%, and I'm actually going to unlink this filter parameter because we don't want that to be linked to the next effect in the list here, the overdrive. And this is a pretty simple one. It's just a overdrive distortion. You'll especially hear it if we start with a sine wave. Just add some overtones and you can change the flavor between lower or higher frequencies, and there's also a level to adjust. And again, there's the dry wet. So it's just a lighter distortion that you could add on there. And you will notice that since I changed slot 1 to a different effects type, it doesn't say the old effect one there. It's just whatever is available in that slot that is selected as that mod parameter. So if you do change some effects, those linkings won't just go away. They will simply change to whatever is in the effects slot that is linked. But at any rate, continuing through, the compressor is a single band compressor. You can change the attack, so the point where the threshold will start to take effect, and you'll see this bar here. You'll see when the compressor is triggered, and that's when the input goes over the threshold, and then you reduce it by the amount of the ratio. So you set when and how much compression on the loudness is happening. The release will be the mod parameter here, and that's just when the compressor will release its compression. Output gain is just an output gain on the entire output of the compressor. And you can also turn on a makeup gain, which will automatically adjust when you move the threshold. But other than that, a pretty straightforward compressor. A bit crusher is, again, a pretty simple one. Just a bit depth, so you can bit crush your sound, and that will be modulatable in the mod matrix if you choose to do that. So you can do some interesting things with that moving, potentially. And downsampling, the combination of the two gives you the classic bit crushing effect, where it degrades and distorts the sound quality digitally. So you can work to see how that will fit with your sound to give it some digital sounding edge and distort it. And you can mix it in with the dry signal as well. But that covers all of the different effects here. And again, they can be placed in whatever chain or bypassed to make it work however it fits for the sound. You can, of course, have the two separate chains for the lines or work them in the series routing. But really, it's a very solid set of effects that we can use in our sound design. And with modulation and all the flexibility that it allows us, we can really do a lot more things than even we've seen so far. But that does cover the effects tab, and we are ready to move into the browser in the next video, so I will see you then. Okay, so now that we have gone through everything in the various tabs of the CZV, we're now going to go into the preset browser, and we can open that up by clicking this button here. And if you're at all familiar with any other Arturia instruments, this is going to make you feel right at home. And even if you're not, it's a very simple workflow to get everything figured out and sorted in here. Whether you're looking for presets that are pre-made from the factory, or you're saving your own presets and just want to find everything and access it quickly and easily. So on the left, we have searching and filtering categories. In the middle, there are the results that will show whatever our searches or filters narrow down to. And then there's info about the preset on the right side, which will show the types that you would have over on the left and the banks, etc. But it's all pretty well laid out. So we'll start with the search bar here, and this will act like anything. You can just search for a keyword. So if we type in bass, and we'll get a few suggestions, we could just type it in and it will suggest a few things. There are the filter by type, or you could also find new sounds in the sound store if you want to do that, or if you know the name directly of a preset, you could type it in there. But as it is, this just searches for everything with bass in the title. So that's probably the most direct way you can find something if you already know the name of it. Let's say you just want to explore. You could filter by a certain type. You could click the bass, and then that will narrow down to everything with bass labeled as the type. So you can just click it in here, and then you pull up that bass, and you can browse through like that. But let's say you want to narrow down further, you can select different styles, and this will just be basically how it would be categorized or described. So say you want a funky bass, you can click that, and then you will get everything that is a bass and has funky as one of the styles associated with it. But if you want to go even further, you can hold down the Control key or Command on a Mac, and then you're highlighting and filtering by 2 of these different styles. So that narrows it down to just one preset, which will have those 2 styles. And that's very good. You can also select multiple types, and then you'd be searching for either leads or basses that are both bright and funky. But after all that, you can clear all, and you're back to the full library of all your presets. And whatever you have in your results column, you can browse through with these arrows to just kind of get a taste of what the sounds might be. Or of course, you could click them directly too. But in the results column as well, we have this shuffle button. So if you click that, at the moment I had it on before, but right now I switched it off and everything is organized and sorted by the columns here. You can select whether you want it to be sorted by name here, and that would just be alphabetical, ascending or descending. And you can just click to change that, or you could also do featured. And featured is just basically if it has this Arturia logo here, those are the featured presets. And you can also sort by type, designer, or bank. And then it will sort it by that. But let's say you have it and you've been browsing and you kind of just get used to the same ones that pop up in that order. You can click the shuffle button, and then it will randomly just put a bunch of the presets in random order. So you get a different order to go through and browse when you click through the arrows, or just kind of a fresh look at a number of different things if you're just browsing. So that's a cool feature, and you get a new random order every time you click it, so your selections never really need to grow too stale. Also in the results, we can select which ones we think are our favorite. I'm going to unshuffle. And you just click this area here where the heart would be in that column, and then you add a favorite. If you note here, you can also click it in the preset information. You can just click it and then the heart shows up there, and then you can filter down to the ones with the hearts just by clicking on that heart. So it's just one more way you can tag presets that you might like more than others, so you can call them back and be able to get them whenever you want to find those specific ones. And I accidentally just double-clicked there, but I was trying to get rid of the favorites, but I accidentally double-clicked on a preset, and that opens the preset and closes the browser, so that's all that happened there. Good to know, though, in case you want to immediately jump into a preset. So you can go in, click, or double-click, and it will go out of the browser, and you can make whatever changes. And then after you do that, you can see at the top you have the asterisk, and then you might want to save this updated preset, and you can do that on the side here. You can also go to the top corner and save preset as, and then you'll get this dialog box. I'm just going to put edit for the title, and we'll leave all the other ones. We could change the bank, and you'll notice that there actually isn't another bank saved here because we don't have presets saved anywhere, but we could type in new into that bank, and then it will make that bank, or you can name it whatever else. You don't have to name it new. It can be anything, and then it will save there. Or if you already have banks that you have saved into, they will be in the drop-down. You can also save the type to any one of these. We'll save this one just as a pad because we're probably not going to keep it for anything other than example purposes. Then you select the various styles that would apply to it, and you can even add your own if you want to call it custom or anything like that. And then you just click it, and you can add comments if you want. And then you'll notice that that style will also be added into the styles list here. So we'll save this preset. And now if we wanted to sort by a style, we have the custom, and that narrows it down to just our one search result. You can clear all or find it by the bank that we saved it in. The user new bank is here, and our preset is selected. You'll notice also that since this one is one that we made ourselves and saved, we can actually delete it, which you cannot do with factory presets, so that's good. If you accidentally think you're saving over anything, you don't have to worry about that unless it is one that you made yourself. You can also just save over it by clicking save, or save it as a new version by using the save as, and then it does the same thing we did before. And you can also add styles to it, anything like that. You want to edit any of those features to make it organized however you want to organize it. Then after that, you can take it even a step further and go into the playlists, and we can create a playlist of any different sounds we might want to add in there. You just type it in and hit enter, and then we can just click and drag into that playlist. And this box will pop up telling you that it made a copy for the playlist, and so any changes you do in here or save in the playlist version of the preset will not affect the preset that you find in the regular browser. So you pretty much just have a separate copy of anything you drop in there, and then you can recall those copies in the playlist directly. And so if we go ahead and jump into the playlist and pick one of the preset copies that we put in there, we could then move over to the browser and try to search for it, and we could probably find it faster if we narrowed down our search to our own bank and select the original browser copy. We can see that these two are acting essentially as two separate presets. You can save and change anything to do with them individually. So it's just another way you can keep track of all the different sounds you have. And we can delete that playlist. Then it's gone. Return here, and we'll delete our preset, and you'll notice that the bank and added style will also go away, because as soon as there's nothing in those sorting filters, they won't be displayed. And that's basically everything there is to see in the browser. There is one more little thing down here, and that is the MIDI controller select for browsing presets if you use any of the Arturia keyboards included here, but that'll only apply if you have those. Other than that, the browser is a great place to find all of this information and keep your presets from the factory or yourself in order. And then anything you save in there will also be filtered up here through all the different types. So finding the sound you're looking for in the CZV, whether you made it or you just want to browse through what Arturia has made, is no problem and is in fact pretty fun. So that's what we've needed to see here, and we're ready to move into the next video where we'll get into some sound design examples, the first one being a bass. So I will see you then. All right, so now we are ready to get ourselves into some example sounds made in the CZV. And so we have ourselves a template just on the default, and it's a basic sine wave with nothing really happening on it, and we're going to make a bass sound out of it. And obviously there can be all kinds of different sorts of basses that we can do here, and we'll just sort of work our way through a few different possibilities, but we can't really hit everything. So we'll make a cool sound and kind of work with it a bit, maybe experiment a little with it, and really at any point we could consider it done, but we'll just see how far we can take it. So to begin, we'll open the extended panel, and we'll go to the synthesis tab, and for line 1, we're going to basically make what will work similar to a low-pass filter whip. So we'll link these for now. And in the DCW envelope, we'll just have a bit of movement for the phase distortion. And that alone almost sounds like a synthesized horn sound almost. But we're going to go down and make it monophonic. And let's also turn the octave down so we get a bassier sound. And honestly, that's not a terrible sound in itself, but we can do a little bit better. Let's now do two separate waves for a compound wave. Let's get some resonance. And now we have one wave just turning to a saw, and the other one working down that resonance sort of path. And that's kind of cool. Let's move the sustain. Maybe edit the slope of this point a little bit. And that's a cool squelch for not even being a filter. And really, that's not a terrible bass. It's kind of cool, actually. But we could do a little bit more. Let's make this a square. And maybe instead of the resonance, let's make a custom wave. For our target, we'll draw in something kind of jagged so that it can get some nice high harmonics. And you can hear the distorted sort of sound on the whip. And it buzzes a little bit, which is cool. So we'll call that good. And let's give it a little bit of an amp envelope too, just so the beginning sort of has a transient. And we could have no attack, but I think we're going to have that back in there a bit. And let's actually move it back up an octave. Yeah, I think that works. Let's turn on line 2 now. And right now that's just a sine wave down here. And we'll detune it down an octave from line 1. And let's copy this DCW over to the DCW on line 2. And we'll move that point down a little bit, so it doesn't have quite as much of a sweep. We'll link the 2 waves, and we'll just do a really resonant phase distortion function, and so it combines to do something kind of cool there. And I like both of them. We can just kind of play with the levels to see which one balances out more, but that's really not too bad of a bass. And that vibrato is on the modulation, which can be cool for basses, and that's just set from the default preset. There's some vibrato there for the modulation wheel. But let's take this a step further. We'll go into the effects, and let's actually work it like a subtractive synthesizer now. We'll use a multi-mode filter. We'll go fully wet. Make it a 24 slope and turn up the resonance. And we'll modulate this cutoff with a mod envelope. So we'll get our mod envelope here. And we're going to link that to the effects and the filter cutoff of effects 1. That's almost talking a little bit now. I'm going to add another point here for the sustain. Double click for that. And we'll just kind of adjust that filter. Get a little bit less resonance on there. And maybe we'll work some of the dry sound in too. Kind of cool. And how about we put some overdrive on it too? That's kind of cool and dirty. I like that. So we're sounding pretty good and moving through. Let's also put a reverb on it. And actually we'll do that on the 4th slot, so it's the last thing, in case we want to add another effect into slot 3 later. But the reverb's just going to take the sound and make it seem like it's in a space. Not quite that much space. We'll turn it down. Lower decay and really not too much size. And that just makes it seem a little bit more real than the dry version. So really that's a pretty cool sound. We could do more portamento if we wanted it to slide differently, and then you could change the character in all these sorts of different ways. Or if we wanted to link macros to some of these modulations so we could offset them or just change the character of the sound a bit, we could do that in the mod matrix. So if we wanted to change the position of the filter and still have the envelope active, we could do that. And of course, there's plenty of different doors we could open and continue looking through for sound design for basses, but we'll call this one pretty good for now, and we'll save it as a new preset. We'll call it example bass. And we could put it in a bass type. We'll put it in a user bank, and it's not initialized. It is kind of a lot of different things. We'll just call it simple for now, and we'll say that's good enough for the moment, and then we could recall that in the browser just fine. But essentially we have a really cool base, and really a lot of it came just from the synthesis and the different ways we can use the phase distortion synthesis. And then taking it further and distorting it with effects and doing some things with the modulations. But with that, we should be ready to move into the next video where we will look at a lead sound, so I will see you then. Alright, so now we're going to use the CZV to make a lead sound. And as with the bass or pretty much anything in sound design, this is a really open-ended process, so we could land in a lot of different places. But we'll try a few things and see how much we can put everything in the CZV to use to make something cool. And again, just kind of experiment with a few of the parameters and phase distortion synthesis that we have at our fingertips here. So like before, we have a default template, just a sine wave. We could start with like the basic template instead, and then we have some of the macros already linked to modulations. And we'll start here to just see how that goes. I actually don't want to have the effects linked right now, so I'll just double click and remove the link to macro 4 here. And I'm actually just going to remove these effects while we're at it because I'm not going to have them in that order. But back to the synthesis tab, we'll start with a sound. And this particular template actually just has a simple pluck almost here using the DCW envelope. And instead of using the CZ envelope as this one has it for line 1's DCW, I'm going to change it to MSEG because I prefer that, and then we can do a few more things with it. And I'll hold shift. We'll scoot it around. And again, like we heard before, this is pretty close to a horn sound, and we can change the timbre, and that's going to offset the DCW setting of line 1 because that's where it's linked in the modulation matrix. But at any rate, we can change that without having to specifically go anywhere else. But that's that basic kind of horn sound. And if we decided we wanted to just use that and slap a reverb on it, it's not really too bad sounding. But for now, we will actually do something a little bit more interesting than that. And let's start by layering on line 2. And for that one as well, I'm going to change it to a MSEG envelope because we have more options with that. And let's sync it and also loop it. And we'll use one of these presets here. And we'll just move some points around, snap, and get some movement in that parameter. And let's actually slow it down because I'm going to have some evolving sort of stuff happening here. I'm just kind of randomly drawing in some stuff here. So that this can do some light, slow phase distortion with line 2, while line 1 will do something a little bit more of the lead. And let's put line 2 up 2 octaves. And let's play with a different shape too. Give it a little bit of offset from the bottom, so there's always going to be a little bit of shape movement, and that's also offsetting from this timbre macro. But let's make this a monophonic sound so that we can just play one note at a time. So it's kind of more what I'm imagining for this lead. I'm going to have a bit of that. I'm going to turn down line 2. I think that'll work. I'm going to not have it fine-tuned up at all. And that's not too bad. Again, let's sort of offset those a little bit more with the timbre macro. And you can hear that little bit of evolution in line 2 where it's changing the DCW there. And let's move into the effects now and put that reverb back on. We'll make it really big. And that vibrato from the mod matrix, since it's linked to the modulation wheel, is fun for pretty much any lead. How about we start decorating things here, and we'll do a flanger. Put some wet into it. Get some depth. A little bit more frequency. I kind of like how that's sitting. Let's change some waves. Let's do some different compound waves here. Let's do a custom wave. And we'll change the base so that has a shape, and then it'll evolve to something kind of jagged. And then for the second one, let's do a double sine. Let's make this a longer decay to the sustain. That's sort of cool. It could kind of sit over some things when it's sort of playing a melody there. Maybe we'll go up another octave and see how that sounds. Well, we'll keep it at 2, and then we'll just bring up the level a little bit. How about we put a delay here, and we'll do some ping pong. We don't need too much feedback, and we don't need it to be really holding back too much. We'll sync it to tempo also. That's kind of cool, kind of spacey. I like how that's sitting. How about we put a little bit of overdrive too, to just give it some crunch. We'll back it off a bit though. Don't want too much happening there. And that's not really too bad. How about we do some unison for it? We'll do 5 voice unison. So it kind of blurs the sound. And you can detune however much you need it to be. Play with different octaves. And it's just a lot of fun to play with all these different sounds. Playing with all the different waveforms and making compound waves that just change the sound that little bit, but it can really make it that much cooler. And like before, obviously this could have gone in a ton of different directions. It could have been tons of different things. Oh, we got a hanging note. That'll happen from time to time. A note hangs and you just hit the panic button to stop it. But basically just keep tweaking around and playing with all the different sounds and ways we have for getting it to the point where it sounds good. You can then tweak all the macros that we had set up in the modulations tab for this template and get it to be the fine-tuned sound that you're looking for exactly. And I'd say that pretty much settles this lead for now. Obviously, we can take it further and do anything else, but we'll just save it into the presets here. We'll call it example lead. And again, we'll just call it simple and a lead. We don't need all these comments, and we'll save it. So easy as that, and we have a really great lead that kind of soars over a lot of stuff, and you can really make it scream. But now we're ready to move into the next video where we'll take a look at a pad sound where we can really take this to an extreme and just go wild with all the different sound design we can do with the CZV. So I will see you in the next video. Alright, so we're ready for one more example, and this time we're going to be making a pad sound. And like the other ones before, we'll start off sort of simple and then we'll work it into something more experimental and maybe step a little bit all over the place and see what sort of stuff comes out of it. Since pads can be anything from a little bit of a background chord sort of sound, or it could even be something big like a massive soundscape or anything like that. So we'll see what we can fit in there and what makes sense and have a little fun with it while we do so. Now I do have this basic template out again, and I did do the same thing before. I removed the effects and got rid of their links in the modulation tab for the effects macro. And other than that, we're just working with that simple sound, and we'll see what we can do to make that something cool here. And first thing, I'm going to, for a pad, make something with a long release. A bit more of an attack as well. And for now, I'm also going to not have any DCW on this. And we're just going to work with a regular sine wave, so nothing too much. And let's turn off the CZ DAC so it's a little bit cleaner to start with. And really, that's kind of calming as it is right now, so let's see what else we can do with it. Let's get a line 2. And we're not going to have it do that. We're also going to have the amp for this have a longer release. I don't think we're going to have the DCW doing that right now. We'll also have it just be a sine wave, and for that, let's also detune by a couple octaves. Make this sort of just a little sparkle on the top with a high note. And even from here, let's put an effect on it. Let's get a chorus so we can give it some sonic depth. Change the voices. And that's not too bad. Let's get some space on it also. We'll do a reverb. And let's also put a delay on it too. We'll do a ping pong. And we want this to move nice and slowly for everything, so we won't feed too much in, and also we'll bring the wet down and deal with the time a little bit. We'll sync it to binary tempo. We don't want it ringing out for too long. Let's try a quarter note synced instead. That's nice and distant. I like the ambience of that. It's kind of nice. So let's play around with a few more things here. I kind of like that. Let's do something in an envelope for the DCW of 1, and we'll make that a MSEG. And let's do some syncing and looping. And we can pick from our templates up here. That's kind of interesting, adding the rhythmic movement of the DCW. We could probably have something else. Let's do this with a square wave instead. I like that. It's a little hectic right now in the context we're using it. So the idea is kind of cool, but I'm not sure we're going to stick with that right now. Let's maybe try something a little bit more subtle. Okay. Let's try maybe a smoother loop. That's good, nice and subtle. Let's bring it up a bit though. We can adjust the rate multiplier. I like the little bit of edge it gives it. Try some waveforms. There we go. I like how all those sounds are playing together. How about if we add a bit of a noise to whoosh with it? Just a touch, and we'll make it kind of dark. So we don't want it to be too prevalent, and I'm going to bring it down even less than that. We'll fine-tune right-clicking and dragging. And I think that's probably going to help, and it'll be able to really give us some extra noise when we put a flanger for an effect as well. I think that's going to add some movement. Get the flanging whoosh. We'll bring up the wet. I could go for even more. There we go. I think that's pretty cool. Might as well keep trying some things. Let's go down an octave. We'll put this detune up one. A bit more open sound. Lots of good movement there. And how about we also get a little bit of movement for the noise itself? So modulation for the volume there. Let's do that with, how about this mod envelope actually? So let's get the mod envelope. And we'll select from the noise generator. We'll get rid of that effects column, and we'll just do the level. And for that mod envelope, we'll have to make it loop. I want it to do so. Let's make the end over here. Flanging on the noise is kind of cool. Let's have the rate be a little bit slower. And change the shape a tad. And we can mess with the macros now. Let's do the timbre since that was set up when we started with the template preset. Nice and rich. That's getting big. And maybe it pushed a little further than it needed to go, but it's definitely worth trying and tweaking around any of the parameters we have at our fingers here, and maybe we even wanted to do a few more things. We could do some work with combinating LFOs or any of the sample and hold things to add randomness and jumpiness to any of the parameters available, or just keep to controlled things like the envelopes so you can keep a sharper eye on what they're doing, but there's just a lot to try out in here. Ring modulate, the noise modulation. There's plenty of ways to introduce different sounds, and it's not only really simple, but also a lot of fun, and it's just really relaxing to get into doing some of these pad sounds and just kind of tweaking around and putting anything in that you can think of, because a lot of the stuff in here just sounds good. You can just immediately pick different shapes of things, different variations of them. And just give an immediate different flavor to what's coming out of the synthesizer. So all that freedom, and you can get some really great sounds in here. And I encourage you to do so. I encourage you to pick through other pads, because really it's a really wide area that you can explore, and we can save our preset as a pad here, example pad, and we can put it in with the pads, and it's simple, quiet, ambient, all of that sort of stuff. We'll save it. And then you can go in and look through any other pads you might see. And a lot of these are a lot of fun. Some have different elements triggering different movements and rhythmic things happening. And just picking apart and looking through like the modulations and stuff like that to see why some of these things are happening can really help to give you some ideas in what you may want to try in your own sound design. Or just as easy, you can pick through and dig any of these out and try them on your mod matrix and just kind of click around and link to everything. Because it can never hurt, and you can always just go back to what you had before, and maybe something cool can come out of it. So, since we're pretty familiar with everything in here, plugging things in and just trying them out can be a lot of fun. So that will do it for our pads right now. And we're ready to move on into the next video where we'll just kind of close up and review everything that we've been through, and we'll set you off to have a lot of fun in the CZV. So I will see you then. All right, so now we have gone through everything in the CZV and used it for a while, played with it, and made some cool things. And it is, of course, a very usable synth that works in a unique way and gives very characteristic sounds that can be really reminiscent of classic synthesizers and give that retro sort of sound. But you can also use it for a ton of other applications because it's a perfectly capable synth in its own right. So just to close things out, we're going to just review everything we've seen so far. And then it's going to be fresh in your brain for when you set out to use the CZV for whatever purpose you have for it, and it will be able to work for you in the best way it possibly can. And firstly, we saw just how and what the phase distortion synthesis was and how it can be used to make different shapes for your bass and target functions. And then your output wave will either be a simple one or an alternating cycle compound wave. And of course, the combinations of different modulations we can do between lines in which the phase distortion can synthesize really unique waveforms and have them interact. And so Casio's and now the Arturia CZV's phase distortion synthesis and what it can do is really an interesting thing to see because a lot of the time you are pretty much used to the kind of synthesis you see in synthesizers, and the CZV, having this unique mode of operation, gives it its unique sound. We, of course, had fun being able to play with it and use it in the different ways, making different envelopes, doing whatever sort of editing within the envelopes and working in the synthesis tab. And in the envelopes tab, we could take the envelopes that we saw there and do even more and use also the mod envelopes so that everything's around, and we could program different kinds of envelope generation modes, the CZ, the DADSR, or the MSEG, each having their own uses and their own strengths and limitations, and then taking whatever we did in all of this so far and linking them to different parameters in the modulations tab with its mod matrix, where you also have access to control your mod envelopes or deal with LFOs and the sample and hold, plus the combinates, where we could put different sources together to basically make a source that incorporates two sources via some combining function. And then those sources are just as easy as picking from a list and then applying it through just an intersection of row and column to any one or multiple destinations, which you select from categories. And there are, of course, so many different ways that we could link this up in varying directions to give control and movement in so many different ways. It's virtually endless. And there's just so much here that we can play with for putting things on macros, the mod wheel, anything like that, and just linking to internal parameters too. There's just no shortage of ways that we can use this. But then when all the sound is generated and put together, you can add effects that come from a solid list of options here, and you can change the routing of them to fit whatever you're looking at, whether it's just everything going through or separated by lines for series and parallel options. And so the workflow is very streamlined if you want to get into all the advanced options, but you can also just deal with things in the front panel alone. Once you have everything set up, you'd be able to have all the macros set to what you wanted in the mod matrix and labeled so that you could just offset those linked parameters to anything that could possibly work and just adjust everything how you may see fit. And of course, you can see in the bottom left corner of the lower toolbar the exact readout of anything you're looking at and its value in a box to the right of your mouse pointer. So picking all of these different options is pretty simple and plenty of fun to just click around and play all the different ways that you can. Whether it's going to be just playing notes, trying out the arpeggiator, doing any of the different patterns that you'd have there in whatever different octaves. There's just plenty of ways we can use this, and it's all very simple and streamlined to fit in your workflow without having too much stress of figuring out how. And once we've done all that, you can save your presets and find all of the awesome ones that are just factory presets. And browse for anything cool you might need to find by type, and then find different styles that can narrow down a search to get you all kinds of different options and find you exactly the sound that is going to fit what you're thinking, whether it's something you've made and organized to be in the right place at the right time, or if it's something from the factory that is going to do the right thing for you. But in the long run, the CZV is a very unique synth as it captures Casio's phase distortion synthesis true to the original and with great care. So being able to use that classic technology in new and modern ways that either mirror the past or look towards the future is both excellent for a creative brain and also just a lot of entertainment value for those who love synthesizers. But with that, we're going to conclude our trip through Arturia's CZV. I hope you had a great time looking through all of the awesome capabilities and listening to a few things the CZV can do. I know I certainly did. Thank you very much for joining me. And with that, I'm Tyler Coffin with Groove 3, and I will see you in the next series.